Hey there, knitters. Welcome to episode 43 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. Today is my first day back filming after an incredible trip to Kenya, and to say that my perspective on life has changed would be an incredible understatement. But because I know so many of you are here for learning and content, I'm not going to dive into that right now. I will save a little bit for the end of the episode so we can just dive right into today's topic. However, for those of you who have been here for a while, you know that my dogs are a really big part of my life. They are my family, they are my children. And I'm sorry to say that despite having a wonderful celebrations for Peach's 16th birthday back in November, the day after I left for Kenya, my sweet Peaches, who had been my child for almost 16 years, left us. It was her time. I think the hardest part was not being here with her when she passed. Whew, I was hoping to get through this without tearing up, but here we are. This is life. She was thankfully home with our other two children, Moo and Callie, and my husband held her as she moved on to the next life. So, yeah, let's just take a second and say, yay, Peaches, you had a great run. Okay, so with that out of the way, for those of you who are still with me, I know emotions are tough to watch sometimes. I'd also like to say a really huge welcome to a huge number of new subscribers. I suspect someone shared my video about short row shaping at Necklines, and we saw a huge influx of new viewers. So to those of you who are here today, thank you so much. It means a lot to me that you would spend your time with me, and I hope you'll continue to get value from my videos. So, because we had so many people join us specifically about that video, we also got a lot of new questions about short rows. So this week and next week, we are going to spend a little bit more time talking about short rows and some of my best practices so that you can add them into your work, specifically at the neckline and at the bottom hem to customize the sweaters that you want to make. So today, that's what we're talking about. We're going to be looking at when you're knitting circular yoke style sweaters, whether that is like a colored yoke with that's worked entirely in the round, or whether it's a raglan style yoke. We're going to look at how to add short row shaping to a pattern that maybe doesn't have it included. Not all designers like to use them, or maybe they've used them, but you want a different depth of short rows. We're going to look at sort of my best practices for where to start and where to stop so you can make the sweater that fits you perfectly. So before we dive into the meat of today's examples, I just want to clarify that when you're working a top-down sweater, short rows can be added right below the neckline to create a lift to the back of the sweater. It'll give you a slightly more anatomical fit at your shoulders and allows the front neck to drop down a little bit. If you're looking for more details on how to use short rows to change the shape of your neckline to sort of give you that dropped front neck, check out episode 26 of this podcast. I'll link it below, but that's one where I really dive into the meat and potatoes of what short rows can and can't do for your neckline. The other thing that designers can do to add shaping to the back of their sweater, especially in garments where there are a lot of color work that you don't want to interrupt in the yoke, you can add them at the bottom of your short row shaping. You can add the short rows at the bottom of your yoke before you separate for the sleeves. We're not going to cover that in today's episode. Today we're specifically going to be looking at the short rows that are worked right at the top of the yoke, right below your collar. So if there is interest in learning more about adding the short rows below the collar work before you separate your sleeves, leave a comment below and we can talk about that in a future video. But I really wanted to focus on what's happening up here because I've seen a lot of questions about what the numbers you need to know are for your short row shaping. So let's dive right into that. So as I think I've mentioned in previous videos, when you are working short rows in a garment, you want them to mimic the shape of the garment section that you're working. So when we are looking at adding short rows right below the collar on a sweater, especially on a circular yoke style sweater, we want to think about them as sloping like this, which is really hard to conceptualize visually when you're working on a round object. I understand there are going to be visuals following this, but essentially, if you think about the shape of a circular yoke style sweater, it's a bit of a cone. It's narrower at the neckline, and as we increase the shapes outwards to accommodate our chest and our upper arm circumference, it's a cone or a pyramid, however you like to think about it. So that's what we want to mimic when we're working our short rows. The top short row that we work, like the very first one, is going to be our shortest. And as we work additional short rows, we're going to work past that point and increase them. So when we're working our short rows at the top of a sweater, we're constantly making the rows a little bit longer rather than shorter. If you worked them the other way, it would still technically work. You're still adding short rows to the top of your neckline, and you would still be using the same number of stitches, but the shape would just be inverted from what you want it to be. And it's, again, not wrong. I suppose it just feels wrong. It just doesn't seem to quite make as much sense to me. So let's take some look at some practical examples of how I approach this using a percentage method, and then at the very end we'll look at actually applying this to a different number of stitches, so you can see the practical application using, for example, a stitch count that you might have on your sweater. One more quick thing before we dive into some visuals on the screen. Every designer is going to have a slightly different opinion on how to approach this, and if you are in the field of looking to start designing your sweaters, I would really encourage you to play with some of these numbers yourself. Some of my clients like to start their short row shaping around 30% and end somewhere between 60 and 70%. Others, like me, prefer to start around 60% and work the short rows up to about 80%. And I know those numbers may not mean much yet. I'm going to jump into them, but I just wanted to clarify that in today's examples, I'm going to be using my preferred percentages. But again, there's not really a right or wrong, but if this is something that you're looking to put into practice with your own designs, definitely play with these numbers. All right, so here's where we're going to go into not a top-down view, an on-screen view. I'm going to put up some diagrams and walk you through the numbers of how I get to my stitch counts, and hopefully that will help enlighten you. So let's jump in. For the purposes of this example, we're going to assume that the beginning of round is at the center back neck. There's a green dot at the back of this sweater that indicates the beginning of round on this example. We're going to use my preferred percentage of starting your short rows at 60% and working our way up to 80%. We're also going to assume that for this example, we want to have 6 short rows worked to achieve our desired shaping at the neckline. We're going to work with a simple number of 100 stitches around the collar, and these short rows are going to be worked immediately below the collar and won't incorporate any increases. On short row 1, because our beginning of round is located at the center back neck, again that's the green dot, we're going to knit 30% of the way around the sweater starting at that beginning of round. And I know I just said we're starting at 60%, but because we're starting our beginning of round at the center back of the neck, we can only work half of our initial percentage. So that means we're going to knit 30% of the way around. Because we're working with an example of 100 stitches, 30% of 100 is 30 stitches. So from this beginning of round point, that green dot, we're going to knit 30 stitches, and then we're going to work our turning point. Whether you use a wrap and turn, or a German short row, or a twinned stitch is entirely up to you. You just want to make sure you have that 30% before you turn your work. On short row 2, we're now going to be on the wrong side of the work, and we're basically going to be mirroring what we did on short row 1, but we're going to be working the full 60%. So from our turning point at the end of short row 1, the little arrow on the left side of the graphic, we're going to be purling to the beginning of round. That's our beginning green dot, which is 30 stitches. And then past that, we're going to purl another 30 stitches, or the remaining 30%. So now, between short rows 1 and 2, we have worked 60% of our total circumference of our neckline. We have worked 60 out of our 100 stitches. On short row 3, we're going to be back on the right side of the work. Starting at the blue dot, which is what I'm calling the turning point at the end of short row 2, we're going to knit all the way to the beginning of round, and then to the turning point that we created on short row 1, which is the arrow closest to the neckline edge on the left side of the graphic. We're going to resolve that turning point and then knit 5% beyond it. And I'll explain that 5% a little bit later on. I just want you to visually see how we're working this. But essentially, that 5% is the difference per row that our short rows grows to get from our 60% up to our 80%. So at the end of short row 3, we have now worked 65% of our total stitches. On short rows 1 and 2, we worked 60%, and on short row 3, we worked an additional 5% to have used up 65% of our total circumference. On short row 4, we're now back on the wrong side again, and we're going to mimic what we did on short row 3. Again, starting at the blue dot, we're going to purl all the way past the beginning of round marker, and then up to the previous turning point that we created on short row 2. We're going to resolve that turning point and then purl 5% more. So we've now used a total of 70% of our total 100 stitches on our needle for the collar. Short row 5 is a repeat of short row 3. We're going to knit all the way past the beginning of round marker to our previous turning point on short row 3, resolve it, and knit 5% more. We've now knit a total of 75% of our total neck circumference. Finally, on short row 6, which is a repeat of short row 4, we're going to purl 5% past our previous turning point, just like we did on short rows 3, 4, and 5. At the end of short row 6, we will have used or knit or purled all 80% of our target total neckline circumference. We've worked our target 6 short rows that we set out, and now we just have one step remaining. We have to work one final short row to get back to the beginning of round. This short row isn't really considered a 7th row, but rather more of an equalizer or a final, like a resolution row, if you will. Back on short row 1, we began our short rows at the center back of the neck. Remember, at that green dot. We were only able to knit half of our target 60% or 30%. This final short row now takes us back to the beginning of round marker and covers the remaining half of the neck stitches that were not knit on short row 1. So once this final short row is worked, we're back at the beginning of round marker and we can resume knitting in the round. So now that we've talked about how I like to approach using our short rows, using the 60% at the top and the 80% at the bottom, let's just talk about where I get those numbers and why they work. Let's start with why they work. The first thing to know about percentages when you're working your short rows is they will translate across any gauge of project that you're working on. If you're working, say, a DK weight sweater and you have 100 stitches cast on at your neckline edge, just like the example we worked with, 60% and 80% of 100 works. If you've cast on, let's say, a bulky weight sweater and you have only 66 stitches or 65 stitches at your neckline edge, the same percentage is still going to work when you use the percentage method. So You can adjust all of the different factors, whether you want more than 6 short rows, whether you use a finer weight yarn or a heavier weight yarn to adapt the number of stitches at your neckline, but the percentage method will always work. So let's just break down some of the numbers that I used in today's example so you know why I had us working 5% difference. So these numbers will vary if you decide you don't like the 60% to 80% method that I use, but you should be able to apply it to any percentage that you decide to use. So first and foremost, the difference between 60% and 80% is 20%, right? We're going to subtract 60 from 80 and we're left with 20. If you think about the turning points that we had up on the screen as our examples, we had an arrow as our turning points on each side. So half of the turning points were on one side of your neck and half of the turning points were on the other side of your neck, which means that we have to take that 20%, the difference between our starting and our ending point of our short rows, and divide it by 2, which means that we have 10% of our turning points on each side of our neck. I hope you're with me so far. I know this is a lot of numbers. What we then want to do is look at the number of short rows that we want to use. I decided I wanted to have 6 short rows in my example. Because each turning point is on opposite sides of the neck, we're going to divide that in half as well. So that means we have 3 short rows on one side and 3 short rows on the other. So now we're going to just focus on the fact that we have 3 short rows on one side of our neck because the other side is a mirror of what we're doing, and focus on the fact that we have 10% of those turning points happening on one side. Again, because the other side is a mirror. So there's 2 more steps that we have to do. The first is we have to take our 3 turning points and subtract 1. The first turning point doesn't count as a space between your 60% and 80%. It is simply the first stopping point. So we're going to take the 3 that we have, subtract 1, and say we're going to have 2 turning points past that initial stopping point. So now we're left with 10% of the stitches that we want to work with 2 turning points. We're simply going to divide that 10% by 2, which means we're going to have a 5% difference in length between our turning points. If we wanted to say, okay, Megan, I want to still have the 10% on each side, so I'm still going to work with the 60% to 80% short row shaping, but I want to have 10 short rows, we can do the same thing. 10 short rows divided by 2 means we're going to have 5 turning points on each side. So we now have 10% with 5 turning points. We're going to subtract 1, so we have 4 remaining. So that means we're going to have our first turning point, and then we're going to have the 4 beyond it. 10 divided by 4 is 2.5. So instead of our interval of shaping being 5%, it's going to be 2.5%. I know I used really simple examples there, but I wanted to show you that the percentage method can work really well at any gauge, and you can always do that division. Now, if your numbers don't work out quite as nicely, perhaps it's not an even 2.5% or an even 5%, perhaps you get 3.33%, that's okay. You can adjust by rounding that percentage or the resulting stitch counts up or down to match that percentage. Generally, I would round up if it's 0.5 or larger and round down if it's 0.49 and lower. But we're going to show that in an upcoming example. But I just wanted to give you an idea of where I was coming up with that knitting 5% more so that you still achieve your 10% difference on each side or 20% total. So now let's go ahead and look at applying this 60 to 80% to a slightly different number of stitches so you can see where I'm rounding my stitches to make the percentage method work. Instead of having a nice pretty 100 stitches cast on, let's say we're working at a finer weight yarn, so we need to cast on 136 stitches at our neckline edge instead of 100. We're going to apply the same percentage method of 60% up to 80% for our short rows, and we're going to continue with the method of using 6 short rows. But I just want to break down the math for you so you can see where my stitches are coming from. We've cast on 136 stitches, and our beginning of round marker is still going to be at the center back neck. On short row 1, which is a right side row, we're going to knit 30%. Remember that this is half of our target 60% for the first row. Because we have 136 stitches on our needle and we're knitting 30%, that works out to be 40.8 stitches. Because 0.8 is higher than 0.5, I'm going to round this up to be 41 stitches. So short row 1 is going to be knit 41 stitches and then work your turning method. Again, this can be the wrap and turn method, the German short row method, the yarn over method, the twin stitch method, whatever you'd like to use. It's that 30% that's really going to count. So make sure you get those 41 stitches. On short row 2, we've got the wrong side facing, and we're going to simply mirror what we did on short row 1. We're going to purl to the beginning of round and then purl 41 stitches and work the turning method. This 41 stitches matches the 41 stitches from short row 1. So now we've worked about 60%, and it's actually slightly more because we rounded up. We've worked 60.25% of the total 136 stitches. On short row 3, because we're still working with the 20% differential and we still have 3 turning points on one side, we're going to be working 5% past the previous turning point. So on short row 3, we've got 136 stitches still because we have not added any increases. We're going to multiply those 136 stitches by 5%, and we get a result of 6.8. Obviously, we can't work 6.8 stitches. And just like on short rows 1 and 2, because the resulting number is 0.8, or pardon me, is a number plus 0.8, we're going to round this up to be 7 stitches. You could round this down to 6 stitches if you're concerned about going beyond your 80%. But essentially what we're going to do is knit to the previous turning point, resolve the wrapped stitch, knit 7 stitches, which is our 5%, and then work our turning method. Short row 4 is a mirror of short row 3, except it's going to be on the purl side. Short rows 5 and 6 are simply a repeat of short rows 3 and 4. On each subsequent row, we will knit or purl 7 more stitches after resolving the turning point on the previous row. So in total, we've worked 41 stitches on rows 1 and 2, and then 7 additional stitches each on short rows 3, 4, 5, and 6, meaning we have worked our short rows to encompass 110 stitches. And just to check that math, 110 stitches worked out of 136 is 80.8%. So this is where the small differences in roundings can affect your numbers. We set our target of starting at 60% and ending at 80%. Because of small differences in rounding, we ended up with the first 2 rows being 60.25% and ending at 80.8%, which is just a stitch here and there. If you feel more comfortable rounding down so that you start at perhaps 59% and end at 79%, that's okay. This is a framework to get you going. It's still really good for you to play with numbers that you are going to feel most comfortable with. Now, today's example obviously was talking about top-down. Certainly top-down sweaters are very popular right now. But if you are working a bottom-up sweater that you are decreasing stitches to get close to the neckline and you want to add short rows right below the collar before you work it to finish your sweater, you're simply going to work everything in reverse. So you would start out with your 80% as you work short rows 1 and 2. And then on short rows 3, 4, 5, and 6, you're going to be knitting short of your previous turning point by that 5%. I know that's a really quick overview, and if you need to see practical examples about that, please leave a comment below. I'm happy to talk about that as well. It would be a really quick recap to just invert the numbers to show you how that works. So that's where we're going to end our practical examples for today. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about my best practices with short rows at neckline edges. Next week, we are going to talk about short rows again, no surprise there, but we're going to be looking at how to use short rows to add a rounded high-low hem to a sweater that you're working in the round. Again, this is going to be specifically for working in the round. If you have questions about how to do it with a rounded bottom using or working your project flat, leave a comment. You know I love comments with questions, so we can talk about that in another video. If you have enjoyed today's episode and feel like you got some useful information out of it, make sure to hit that like button. And if you're not already a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. We've got great new content that comes every week to help you on your knitting journey to making yourself your favorite sweaters. Now, for those of you who are still with me and wanted to hear a little bit more about Kenya, I will say this. It has changed me wholly. How I view other people, how I view the work that I do, how I look at just the world in general has definitely been under a major shift. Certainly, we saw some absolutely incredible animals and vistas and met some wonderful people. I'm not going to go too into depth with it right here because I think it deserves to be its own video. And even though I've been home for more than a week, I'm not sure I still have the words to put it all together just yet. I'm feeling a lot of things about it. And I had some illness to deal with when I got back. So I am going to be putting that into a separate video called the Sunday Special. But because this is a fun one, I'm not going to make it one of my regularly scheduled Wednesday videos. It will be coming soon as a Sunday Special. So I hope you'll join me. But to hold you over, I'm going to share a couple of my favorite videos with you here. And of course, some pictures of the animals. Before I sign off with all of my beautiful videos and pictures, I just want to thank you so much for being here with me this week. It always means so much to me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and as always, happy knitting. Yeah.